Okay, so I had basically made a mistake here, guys. So when it came to our coverage over the X-Men, I had completely forgot to talk about and cover the Cable miniseries that took place right before the X-Cutioner song event. And so with that being said, I had already recorded the first two chapters of the actual event. And really, I kind of want to go ahead and continue on with our coverage over the X-Cutioner song. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and completely cover the entire event. And then down the road, we're going to come back and actually cover the Cable miniseries that takes place before the actual event. And so if you're somebody following our playlist, don't worry. I'm going to make sure all the videos are lined up in the correct order so that you'll be able to have the full understanding of what is happening with the X-Men around this era of time, especially if you are a Cable fan. Now, with all that being said, today's video, we're going to cover X-Cutioner Song Chapter 3, 4, and 5, the next three chapters of this huge, big event for the X-Men. Now, when it comes to these three chapters, we are not really going to learn a lot about what's happening with the X-Men. Really, when it comes to these chapters, we're going to see more battles happening between different X teams, but also X characters as well. Like, for example, we're going to see Apocalypse beat down on the X-Men. Y'all heard that right. Apocalypse beating down on the X-Men. But also, we're going to see Bishop get his butt kicked by Mr. Sinister. Like, I feel bad for the X-Men in these three chapters, really. Now, we're also going to see that there's some bigger moves being made behind the scenes by a certain character. A character that has been hyped up a lot when it came to our coverage over X-Force and X-Factor. And that would be Strife. But either way, let's go ahead and dive into the next three chapters of the X-Cutioner song. And so as we dive into the third chapter of this event, we actually pick up with X-Men issue number 14. Now, the opening pages of this book does a great job in reminding us what is going on right now with this event. The whole idea that Cable had tried to kill off Charles Xavier by giving Charles the techno-organic virus. Now, the techno-organic virus is a big deal in Marvel Comics. And the reason why, because it basically takes living tissue and turns it into a mechanical organism. And so right now, Charles Xavier is actually going through that process at the moment. And so for the X-Men, they are actually freaking out here because they have no idea if they are able to actually save Charles' life. And the thing is, there's no actual cure. And so it's the X-Men trying their best to at least find one, or to at least find a way to slow down the process so they're able to find a cure to get rid of the actual virus. Now, like I said earlier, it was Cable supposedly who had shot Charles Xavier, who had gave Charles the actual virus. And for the X-Men and X-Factor, the last thing they heard about Cable was that he was the leader of X-Force. Now, they have no idea that Cable had left X-Force behind and Cannonball had taken on the role as the leader of the team. Either way, for our two teams of heroes, they believe if they go after X-Force, they should be able to find Cable. If they find Cable, then maybe they can find a way to save Charles Xavier. And so now we're seeing the hunt for X-Force truly begin here. But now we have to jump over to Mr. Sinister. Now, in our last video, we had talked about the idea of Sinister pretending to be Apocalypse as a way to trick the four horsemen of Apocalypse to help him out, because they believed the entire time that they were working for their master, that they were talking to their master, but in reality, they were talking to Sinister. Either way, he had the four horsemen of Apocalypse to go after Cyclops and Jean Grey and actually capture them and bring them back over to him. Now again, they still believed they were talking to Apocalypse, not knowing they were working for Mr. Sinister. Now, after that, we kind of find out in this chapter that he has taken Cyclops and Jean Grey over to the Mutant Liberation Front. Now, this is a group of characters that we had actually talked about before in the past in our previous videos. You see, originally, they were a group of characters that were being led by Strife. Now, at this point in our coverage over the X-Men, we don't know much about Strife. All we know is that he looks like Cable, and he also hates Cable a lot as well. And that's really it. Now, when it came to him and his group, they were only going after different government bases that were kind of being used as a way to attack the mutant race. But now it seems like they got bigger plans, especially with Cyclops and Jean Grey. And so once you have Sinister being able to make the trade, they give him the genetic matrix. Now, we have no idea what that is just yet, but of course, down the road, we might learn more about it. But now we have to jump over to X-Force. Now, when it comes to X-Force, in our last video, they had just, well, really barely survived a battle against X-Factor. Because remember, right now, X-Factor and X-Men, they believe that with Cable trying to kill off Charles Xavier, and of course, the last time they heard anything about Cable, he was the leader of X-Force, they believe that X-Force may be involved with what Cable is trying to do. But also, they're trying to find X-Force to hopefully find Cable. Now, for X-Force, they were able to barely get away from X-Factor when it came to their battle. The problem is, Havoc made sure to do some damage to their aircraft. And the reason why, because it is going to leave a trail for the X-Men and X-Factor to follow to hopefully find X-Force. Now, when it comes to X-Force, they're trying to survive right now because their aircraft can no longer stay in the air. And so they have to use their powers as a way to basically survive the crash. And when they do, they're kind of wondering what to do next because they now know that sooner or later, X-Factor and the X-Men are going to be able to find them. And when they do, can X-Force actually survive a battle against both teams at the same time? But now we have to jump over to Egypt. And the reason why, because we pick up with the Dark Riders. Now, the Dark Riders are another group of characters who actually work for Apocalypse alongside with the four Horsemen of Apocalypse. Now, when it comes to the Dark Riders, they are actually went to Egypt to wake up their master, and their master being Apocalypse. Now, like I said in our last video, when it came to Apocalypse, the last time we saw him was when X-Factor, the original X-Factor, fought against them alongside the Inhumans, and we were kind of left to believe in the possibility that he may be gone. But here he is right now, waking up after being in a chamber, slowly healing up after his last battle. And right now, he's very angry about being let out before he had been completely properly healed. But you have the Dark Rider say, hey man, listen, somebody is using your horsemen without your permission. Somebody is making moves against different members of the X-Men in your name, and we have no idea who it could possibly be. And so now Apocalypse has to get involved in this event. But now we must jump over to the X-Men and also X-Factor as they make their way over to a location of where X-Force is possibly at. Now, in these 3 pages, it's really more of these two teams trying to get a better understanding of X-Force. And let me explain. You see, in the early 1990s, all the different X-Men teams were kind of different from one another. Like the 2 X-Men teams, Blue and Gold team, they were the same. They were trying to carry on Charles Xavier's dream. But when it came to X-Factor, they were more like the government team, trying to build relations between the government and also the mutant race. But when it came to X-Force, they were that military team, that Black Ops team, that was not really afraid to cross the lines if they had to. If they had to kill somebody, they were okay with the idea of killing that person. Like, for example, Mask, who was the leader of the Morlocks in the early 1990s. Either way, for our 2 teams here, they're trying to understand how can a group of characters like X-Force follow a man like Cable. But for Wolverine, it makes a lot of sense because those members of X-Force are basically soldiers. Cable is their general. It's Wolverine saying, when times get hard for you, you begin to change into somebody you never thought you would become. But also, as time gets hard for you, you have a better understanding of how the world truly is. Either way, once you have our two teams realize they can find X-Force, they head straight over to that location. Now, I want to jump over to Cable because Cable has actually been gone the entire time this event has kicked off, which means that the Cable we saw earlier was not actually Cable. And that is why I said when it came to the Cable miniseries, we should have covered that series before the actual events of the X-Cutioner song. But don't worry, down the road, we're going to cover that actual story. Either way, with Cable being able to come back to this time, he gets to update what happened while he was gone. And he comes to find out that Charles Xavier had basically been shot at, has been given the techno-organic virus. Now, for Cable, he's all like, that should have never happened. Who in the world has shot Xavier? And that is when Cable finds out, well, it was himself. Or we seem to be somebody else pretending to be him. Either way, Cable realized he has some work to do. Now, I want to jump back over to the X Mansion where we do pick up with Bishop and Jubilee being on guard. Now, for those two characters, they're the only two X-Men characters right now at the X Mansion. Both of the X-Men teams right now are on different missions. You see, the blue team, which is usually Cyclops' team, they're on a mission with X-Factor right now to find X-Force, while you have the gold team right now on a mission to find out what happened to Cyclops and Jean Grey, and why did Apocalypse possibly kidnap them. And so for Bishop, he had decided to stay behind as a way to protect Charles Xavier. And Jubilee, well, she also stayed behind as well. Either way, with those two characters, they're on guard right now of the entire mansion, except somebody was able to sneak their way into the actual place. And so for Bishop, once the alarms goes off, he runs back inside, and we come to find out it was Mr. Sinister. But now he has two hostages between him and Bishop. That will be Stevie Hunter and Val Cooper. Now, for Mr. Sinister, he says he came here to make sure that Charles Xavier pays for his sins. In the ending of this chapter, we jump back over to the X-Men and also X-Factor as they arrive at the location of where X-Force has been hiding at. And so for these two teams, at first, they're kind of wondering, where is X-Force hiding at? But then by the end of this chapter, you have X-Force pop out, and they kind of realize they have no choice here. If they want to get away from the X-Men and X-Factor, they're gonna have to fight against them right here, right now, in the middle of the jungle or desert. And so this leads into the next chapter where we're going to see X-Force trying their best to handle two different X teams coming at them at once. Now, part 4 takes place in X-Force issue number 16. Now, with that being said, we do pick up with X-Force about to battle against both the X-Men, the blue team, and also X-Factor. Now, for X-Force, they're trying their best to talk to the other two teams like, hey, listen, we're not really with Cable. Matter of fact, we were trying to find Cable as a way to bring him in. Now, technically, you don't have X-Force saying that to X-Factor and the X-Men team, but they really want to sit down and talk things out and explain things to the other two teams. But unfortunately, it kind of seems like no one is really able to slow things down and just talk it out. And so, of course, we do get a battle between all three X teams. Now, unfortunately, it's not fair for X-Force because you have two different teams coming at you at once from both ends. And so, after a few pages, after you have X-Force trying their best to survive this battle, you have Cannonball say, hey, X-Force, we gotta retreat. Let's go ahead and hide in the jungles as a way to get away from them, because right now, if we stay here, we are going to lose this battle. Now, getting over to the other X team, they had decided to, look into what exactly happened to Cyclops and Jean Grey. And so their main goal is to find the four horsemen of Apocalypse. Really just three at this point in time. But either way, you do have our heroes decide to go look for the horsemen of Apocalypse. And when they do, they get into a battle at this warehouse where they found the horsemen hiding at. Now, we do get a few pages of our heroes actually battling against the horsemen of Apocalypse. But by the end of the battle, you have our heroes being able to easily win that battle, also with the help of Quicksilver as well. Now remember, Quicksilver was a mutant around his time in Marvel Comics, but also he was part of the X-Factor team, but he came with the X-Men to help out to hopefully find Apocalypse and to bring down Apocalypse, but to also find Jean Grey and Cyclops. Now, once you have our heroes being able to defeat the Horsemen, you didn't have the X-Men find something left behind by somebody else. And we kind of find out it was a message left behind by Mr. Sinister, because he knew that sooner or later the X-Men would come after the Horsemen to find Cyclops and Jean Grey. He also knew that the Horsemen would lose to the X-Men. Either way, he tells the X-Men like, hey, listen, so it was me who had actually sent the Horsemen after Cyclops and Jean Grey. But I'm telling you right now, I no longer have them. Also, my part in this crazy game is officially over. But I am going to tell you one last thing though. You see, this whole entire game is being done because of Apocalypse, because he's the reason why you have somebody very ticked off playing this game against all the different moving pieces. And then you have Sinister basically in the message. And so for our heroes, they're kind of wondering, who is he talking about? If Apocalypse is not the one in charge of this game, then who is actually in charge of this game? And really, when we jump back over to the X-Mansion, we finally pick back up with Bishop getting ready to shoot Sinister to hopefully save the life of Stevie Hunter and also Val Cooper. Now, for Sinister, he believes that Bishop will not actually pull the trigger. Yo, this homeboy was completely wrong, because you have Bishop go ahead and pull that trigger so fast, he leaves a hole in Sinister's head. Now, you would think like, okay, he's dead. But you didn't have Sinister get right back up and say, nah, I cannot die that easily. But also, I want to tell you that I'm only here to hopefully lead you guys in the right direction to figure out who is actually behind this whole entire crazy scheme. And so after he leaves a paper behind for Val Cooper to read. And so now she knows who may be behind all of this mess. But now we have to jump over to Cable. Now really, this one page is just Cable getting ready to get involved, because he actually knows who's behind all of this. But for Cable, he wants to make sure that he is properly prepared to deal with the person behind all of this mess at the moment. But now we have to jump over to Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now remember, Sinister had handed over Cyclops and Jean Grey over to the Mutant Liberation Front, really their leader, and that would be Strife. Now for Strife, this is the moment where he begins to call himself the actual crown prince of the mutant race. But then he calls Cyclops and Jean Grey his father and mother. And it's kind of like, wait a second, what does that actually mean? And so to wrap up this chapter, we jump back over to X-Force. Now X-Force, they're trying their best to get away from X-Factor and the Blue Team X-Men. But the problem is, well, the Blue Team and X-Factor, they're not trying to give up. And they have sent Wolverine to hopefully find X-Force in the jungle. Now for Wolverine, it's kind of like having a wild animal on your team. And so for Wolverine, he was able to easily track down X-Force. And then one by one, you have each member of the X-Force being taken out by different members of the X-Men and also X-Factor. And so with that happening, well, by the end of this chapter, X-Force has now been officially captured by X-Factor and the X-Men. And now they are going to be taken back to the X-Mansion, so you have our two teams begin to interrogate X-Force to hopefully find the information that they are looking for. The problem is they might not get that information that they're actually looking for. But now we have to jump into Uncanny X-Men issue number 295, where we actually pick up with Apocalypse. Now, for Apocalypse, this is a man who's trying to figure out what the heck is going on here when it comes to his Horsemen, because he got word from his Dark Riders that the Horsemen of Apocalypse have been going on the world fighting against the X-Men in his name. And for Apocalypse, he has no idea why, because he has not told his Horsemen to do anything at all. And so he wants to know what in the world is actually going on. Now, this is an Apocalypse who's not fully healed up yet, because this man has gone through his healing chamber, but not all the way yet. And so he was released early by the Dark Riders, who told him like, hey boss, your Horsemen are going crazy out there without your actual guidance, and we have no idea why. And so he had to leave his healing chamber early to figure out what's happening with the Horsemen of Apocalypse. Now, when he does arrive at one of his safe houses, he's then confronted by the X-Men, who were able to realize that this was one of his safe houses and they were now looking for him. Now, I want to jump back over to the X-Mansion. Here's the reason why. Because X-Force is now prisoners for X-Factor and also the X-Men. But also, I kind of want to say that for X-Force, they are a young group of kids who were unfortunately turned into soldiers for some kind of war that Cable had against unknown enemies across the world. And so for Polaris, she hates the idea that these young kids are being locked up as prisoners. And so for Havoc, he says, you have to understand that technically right now, they are best chance to finding Cable. But also for Havoc, it's kind of like those kids chose a path. They chose the path to become soldiers. They're no longer really trying to follow Charles Xavier's dream. But either way, X-Force is now prisoners of X-Factor and the X-Men. Now we actually jump back over to Psylocke, and you really have Psylocke standing by Charles Xavier, and she sees a techno-organic virus slowly killing him off. Now for Psylocke, she kind of feels like the best way to actually help out Charles Xavier is to help him move on. But at the same time, she wants to make sure that it's something that he wants to do. Either way, she is called away for a big meeting. But now we're kind of left with the idea that Psylocke might actually do it. Now, we actually do get a small preview of the battle between the X-Men and also Apocalypse, because like I said earlier, Apocalypse is going to give the X-Men one heck of a beatdown. And so you do have the Gold Team trying their best to battle against Apocalypse. And at first, it may seem like because he's in a weaker state, they might actually win. Guys, let me tell you right now, that was one heck of a mistake for the X-Men to think they'll be able to actually take on Apocalypse. But now we have to jump back over to Jean Grey. Now remember, Jean Grey is currently a prisoner for, well, Strife. And we have no idea why yet. Now earlier, we saw him call Jean Grey and Cyclops mother and father. And him call himself the prince of the mutant race. And so we're kind of left to believe in some kind of way that he is actually the child of Cyclops and Jean Grey. But the question is, how? How in the world is that possible? But either way, Jean Grey is still being tortured by this man. And she wants to know why in the world he's doing all this for. But getting back over to the X-Men and also X-Factor, they are now informed by Val Cooper that she had received information about who is actually the man behind everything happening at the moment. And of course, that would be Strife. Now, for all of our heroes, they don't know much about this character. At the same time, they still feel like it's actually Cable who has been pretending to be Strife the entire time. Really, when it comes to our two teams here, they have so many different theories of what's really going on when it comes to Cable, but also Strife as well. Either way, it's now our heroes kind of realizing that maybe Strife is the one pulling all the strings. But the question is right now, is Cable actually Strife? Or is there a possibility it's two different people right now? Now for Val Cooper, she wants to know where in the world is Wolverine and Bishop at? And we kind of find out that Bishop and also Wolverine had went over to Department K. Now, Department K is really more like the special government branch for Canada. And the problem is, well, Department K was not really able to share resources to Val Cooper and X Factor when it came to hunting down, well, Cable. And so for Wolverine and Bishop, they kind of feel like Department K is hiding something. So you had these two characters just working together, taking out different members of Department K. And it's also kind of building up that friendship between these two characters because you have Bishop say, hey, Wolverine, listen, I love the idea of being here with you, but please make sure you don't tell Storm what I am actually doing here. Like, possibly killing some people. And for Logan, he's all like, hey, you know what? I won't tell a soul at all. Now I want to jump back over to Apocalypse because you have Apocalypse delivering that beatdown over to the X-Men because you have the X-Men believing that they might have a chance in actually beating down on Apocalypse. Like I said earlier, this is Apocalypse in a weaker state. Like they should be able to win, you would think. But no, y'all, this is Apocalypse. This man ain't playing around. This man said y'all have truly messed up. And so you have Apocalypse beat down on all the X-Men Gold team right there in his safe house. Now, for Apocalypse, he realized that what the X-Men were saying could possibly be true. There's somebody else out there pulling all the strings. But the question is right now, who? And so you have Apocalypse realize that he has to reserve his powers until he's able to find out who is the real person behind all of this mess. But now we have to jump back over to Gambit and also Havoc. Now you have these two characters meeting up with, well, Cannonball. Now, when it comes to this meeting, it's really more of Gambit and Havoc wanting to know what Cannonball knows about the Mutant Liberation Front, the group being led by Strife. Now, for Cannonball, he does not know much about the actual group. Really, for him, he knows about the same amount of information as the other two groups know. He might know a tad bit more, but that's really it. But for Cannonball, it's kind of like, listen, if you're trying to figure out which safe house they're staying at, I might have an idea. But before I am able to share that kind of information over to you, I need you guys to know that I want a deal being made. Basically saying like, hey, I want to see X-Force be released without any kind of charges at all. Now for X-Factor and the X-Men, they're kind of like, that's not going to happen. But guess what? If you help us, we'll allow X-Force to help us out to bring down Strife. Now for Cannonball, he does agree. But the problem is though, he's kind of like, listen, I don't know the exact location of which base he could possibly be at, but I might have an idea, maybe. Now, the ending for today's video is going to be one heck of a cliffhanger because you actually do have a story jump back over to Wolverine and also Bishop, who are currently still at Department K. But while being there, well, somebody else arrives. And that would be good old Cable. And Cable's all like, great, I found these two guys. And these two guys are about to fight against Cable. And so this is where we are going to end today's comic book video. So please, leave me a like down below and subscribe. Also, if you have any suggestions on books I should read, well, please let me know in the comments below because you never know, your suggestion could be a future video down the road. But guys, see y'all next time. Later.